Hello, I'm Lotfi Twiggy, and welcome to this PMI Tunisia Chapter webinar with over 100 registered individuals. Today, we are talking strategy, more specifically how to understand the strategy implementation gap. This is something that a lot of organizations, both large and small, really struggle with. In a study sponsored by PMI Brightline Initiative, they spoke with 500 senior executives from organizations with annual revenue starting with and exceeding $1 billion US dollars. They found that 90% of their respondents said that their companies had failed to reach their strategic goals simply because they didn't implement well. No need to emphasize on the impact on the organization profit and loss statements. This is really costly. And it's not only about money spent, but also about the opportunities that are lost. That's why we are seeing a lot of organizations looking for better ways to bridge the gap between strategy and implementation. And a lot of them are turning to project management approaches and looking at, in order to help their teams be more proactive to shifting priorities and really keep their eyes on those long-term strategic goals. And that is exactly what we are talking about with our honorable guest today. Our conference will last about 40 minutes, and then we'll spend 15 minutes for questions and answers. So you can ask your question throughout the presentation in the questions section of the dashboard. I would like to remind you that your presence at these events entitles you one PDU and you will have all the information at the end of this webinar. And now, without further ado, please join me welcoming Mr. Lee Lambert, our honorable guest.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, let me just introduce you very quickly. Throughout his tremendous career, Mr. Lambert quickly ascended to senior management position and was responsible for the development and implementation of groundbreaking, sophisticated enterprise project management processes for engineering, medical diagnostic, and R&D. In 1981, as a result of his pragmatic application of the PM methodologies, he was invited to be an integral part of the creation of the PMI Project Management Professional Certification Program. He is a recipient of the PMI's Distinguished Contribution Award. Mr. Lambert is a frequent lecturer in the prestigious Washington University's Executive Roundtable Series. His most recent professional recognition was being named one of the only 70 PMI Fellows. He also received one of the PMI's highest honors for his groundbreaking applied learning programs, the Professional Development of the Year back to 2007. Author of 2 books and several professional papers, Mr. Lambert, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That's a great introduction. As I listened to what you had to say, it started to make me realize what you're really telling people is that I'm really old. I mean, I've been around for longer than dirt in some cases. 53 years I've been doing project management. And through the evolution of the methodologies that we use, I've really started to recognize this move towards the linkage of strategy and the individual project management activities that we do. Unfortunately, senior level people, even though they talk about it and it sounds good when they say it fast, there's some issues associated with linking projects to strategy that sometimes management's not really anxious to incorporate into their thinking. So I want to spend some time with you today because I think that this is a key issue. But for a different reason, I think, than when Ricardo Vargas did the Brightline study, he had some certain specific ideas he had in mind, and I think he did a great job, and it gave us some information that is necessary. But I think there's another side of this strategic linkage that I want to kind of express today, because I think it's an important one for people who are actually delivering projects. Now, the way we can bridge that gap is to get a closer connection between the strategic objectives of an organization and the tactical execution of projects within that organization. So back when I started in the business of project management, it was about 1967 roughly. Probably, in fact, I know probably before some of you that are listening today were even born, I was doing this kind of activity. But back then, when I got a project, I was assigned a project. We didn't have a thing called a charter at that time, but with the same thing. It was a scope description and a basic estimate. When we were assigned that, one of the beauties of it was at the same time we were assigned the project, we were also assigned a team of people with the appropriate skill sets to deliver that project. And those people were committed. They were dedicated to the project. So in a way, back in those days, my job was easy on a comparative basis. But as we see what's going on today, the more we've moved into this competitive environment, the more we see the utilization of a matrix environment where projects don't generally have dedicated teams. Rarely. In fact, I used to always say if you got a dedicated team, you know you got a hot project, because they just don't dedicate teams to projects. They look at the resource pools, the silos, I think as we call them a lot, to see what skill sets are needed for any given project, and then they assign those out, but they loan them out. So rather than being solid line to the project managers, the resources that are going to be the ones who deliver are dotted line to the project management, solid line to the resource pool. So silo, for example, engineering, chemistry, quality, all the resource pools that we have, and they assign them out. So that's sort of the way we do business. Well, part of the reason they're having the strategic linkage project delivery difficulty is that we're not doing a very good job of managing what resources go on what projects. And so we have to look at this from two perspectives. One, from the project manager's perspective, as he or she wants to have the right people to deliver the project. And then we have the silo managers, or the resource skill set pools, if you will, who their job is not to necessarily get any one project done. Their job is to allocate their resources across the organization so that no one is underapplied and no one is overapplied. So that's balancing act for the resource pool, but they tend to look more for their own information to be sure they've got all their people allocated. Whereas the project manager, he or she has to look at what are the strategic linkages of my project. Now, why is that important? Okay, the reason that's important is one of the only ways that you can really have power. And if any of you project managers think you have a lot of power, I mean, I'd like you to get over that, because generally speaking, that's really not the case. We don't have the ability to make decisions. There's always someone at a higher level to make those critical decisions. And so we've got to stay linked to the strategy. And the reason for that is simple. The more I can demonstrate my projects linked to the organizational strategy, the more possibility I have to impact or empower people to do their job, because doing their job means meeting the requirements of the strategy. So we've got to tie this together so we understand what it is we're trying to accomplish. So that's what I want to spend some time on. The other element that we have to think about here is that, again, in the olden days, back in the 60s and 70s, we pretty much ran our projects by hand. I mean, it was paper and pencil. That's the way we got things done, by hand, and a lot of darn work. Well, now, you know, we don't have that. We have automated systems. We can give you information 9 ways from Sundays. I can give you a mountain of information in a heartbeat. So now what we've got to do is be sure that we're using the right information. So as we go through this process, be thinking about what's my strategic linkage of my project. Therefore, what leverage do I have in terms of getting decisions made on resource utilization and allocation? Two is, what information do I need to maintain that connection so that I can communicate with the owner of those strategic objectives, so that if there's a problem or a challenge because of this positioning of that strategic objective, I've increased my leverage to get the right people at the right time. So it's not a difficult task. It's one that requires a lot of relationship development in terms of the ties between a project manager and a strategic linkage. Those are things that we have to develop over time. So that's where I'm going to go with this, and I'm going to make it sort of simple. It's kind of like, when they say it fast, it seems simple. So I'm gonna say it pretty fast. But you know from what I'm saying, it's not brain surgery, but in fact it does take some concentrated effort to assure that we're going to be able to get the things done that we want to get done. Next slide, please. So here's our situation. We're in kind of a different environment. Again, back in the 60s and 70s, when I was an active project manager getting things done for GE and for national laboratories and for government clients, we didn't have anything called, I think you guys call it agile. We just had predictive methodologies. We had work breakdown structures, and we had schedules, and we planned the project and we executed the project, and that's the way we did business, and it ran us into a lot of problems. And you can imagine, when you're looking at a predictive model and you don't know exactly over a 2-year time frame what the end product really looks like, you know what maybe you'd like it to look like, so you can begin to see the changes that take place in the evolution of the project. Well, in 2001, a group of very smart people gathered together at the Snowbird ski resort in Park City, Utah, and put together the Agile Manifesto. Now, the only difference, I mean, I'm going to be kind of candid here. The big difference, I shouldn't say the only, the big difference between the predictive model and the agile model is that the agile people take a much more frequent look at how are we doing compared to how we thought we were going to be doing. So rather, instead of waiting on the predictive, oftentimes we didn't report, but every month. Well, for goodness sakes, what can happen in a month's time? With the IT environment now moving to the agile concept, with the scrums and the sprints and the stand-ups and the retrospectives and all that buzzwords that we now use, this is one thing that I think they've accomplished with the agile idea, and that is it stays on track, because every single day you do a stand-up meeting. And all of the people that are participating on the project, and this includes, by the way, strategic objective owners, they are participating in a one-day stand-up, which is every single day over a 2-week sprint time frame, typically. Every single day, this group of people, these project people, get together, and they ask they have 3 simple things they want to look at. What did we get done yesterday? What are we going to do tomorrow? Or today, I'm sorry, and what's going to get in the way of me doing that? Those 3 components give you instant feedback on progress. The evolution of the requirements is a natural byproduct of this kind of an approach. So it says we don't have to know exactly what this looks like in the beginning, but we're going to evolve into it. So you don't think we were stupid back in the old days. I want to point out to you that in the PMBOK, now the PMBOK was written, the first PMBOK was written in 1996. That was published, I should say, in 1996. It was 119 pages. It was no big deal. But in that particular document, and I still have a hard copy on my shelf, in that particular document, it had a concept called rolling wave planning. And if you looked at the details, it basically said, we're not going to plan a project from its start to its finish. We're going to short-term plan, and then as we get to that time frame elapsing, we'll reach out and pull in more detail. Well, that's the birth of Agile. They don't give us credit for that, but that's kind of the same thing Agile does now, and does very effectively. It does have some impacts on you project people, though. People that are project managers have seen the depth of their responsibilities shrink a little bit with the advent of the Scrum Master. In the Agile environment, the Scrum Master now becomes sort of the key player, and project management role is slightly different and much more of a communications role as opposed to a control role. So no matter which ones of these do, whether you do the predictive or the agile or the hybrid, you're heading in the same direction. You're heading in the idea that you are being put together as a team of people to execute a project, to get it done in a timely way. Now remember, when they set the objectives for this particular activity, the LinkedIn strategic objectives, this is usually a year, sometimes even more, in advance of when you might actually see a project show up on your desk. Next slide, please. So the problem we're getting into is, do we really understand what strategy is? Do we really understand why we have projects that when they're done, we hope to say we've delivered the strategic objectives that this was a party to? So we don't know what that is. What that means is when the senior level decision makers, and I don't know about you, but I wasn't involved in that for years and years in my career, but when they go away to do planning for the organization, they're going away to look at what do we need to do next year to increase our market share, to increase our profitability, to use our resources more effectively. I mean, there's a whole plethora of objectives that they want to address in regards to deciding what their objectives, their strategic objectives are. Well, once they have those strategic objectives, that's where we come in. Because now they got to spend time saying, okay, what kind of projects do we want to conduct that will help us meet, for example, our market share? What kind of projects would increase our market share capacity? What kind of projects would increase our cash flow? What kind of projects would reduce the cost of delivering our product? Those are all strategic objectives in an organization that drive out projects. So when you get a project, it's not just about a project, it's about the organization. It's about the contribution you get to make. Now, again, when I was doing projects, we had no linkage to strategic objectives. I mean, we got a project and our guidance was get her done. And so we'd get it done. And we never really asked, well, why is this so urgent? Why is this important? Where does it fit? We never really asked that. I'm guilty of that as well. I never really asked that. But what I'm going to tell you today, if you want to be a successful project manager, you need to invest some time understanding how and why you need to connect with the strategic objectives of your organization. That's not negotiable. In my view, it's not a negotiable element that we have to pay attention to. But the next slide, please. But what happens is we sort of get overwhelmed by it, and because oftentimes when I used to ask, when I finally did start asking, where does my project fit in the strategic linkage? Where does it fit? Generally speaking, I didn't get an answer. It's kind of something like, go away, little boy, just go do your project. We can't do that. If we've got a project and we're going to be held accountable to delivering that project, we need to understand why. Why are we doing the project? What is the contribution it makes to the strategic objectives? And how can I utilize that connection, that reference point of importance for my project? How can I utilize that to enhance my ability to deliver the project? Whether it's to have an effect on resource availability, have an effect on the way you spend the money, what facilities you're going to use, all of those can be linked back to the strategic objectives that project supports. Okay. Now, granted, we've gone a step further in today's environment, because rather than just having an organizational strategy, now we've started to use a concept of either portfolio management or program management. Both of those terms are used similarly in organizations, and the PMI has seen this coming, and we now have a portfolio management credential, we have a program management credential, and both of those, here's my view, both of those are basically project management on steroids. The only difference is in a, say for example, portfolio, which is kind of popular these days, is that within that portfolio, what we do is we gather together projects with similar relationships to strategy. So now we've got all the strategic objective number 1. Underneath that is a portfolio that has 6 or 7 projects, all of which support the strategic objective and therefore can be managed as an integral unit. Same with programs. Programs tend to be a little bit bigger, but the same concept. We want to be able to house like projects underneath a strategic objective. So we see organizations making moves in that direction. The PMO sometimes is the housing for some of those kinds of projects as well. The PMO is used in such a diverse way in organizations that it's hard to say what's normal and what's not, but it can certainly have a big role to play in providing support in the way of decision support information, in the way of the appropriate staffing for any given organization. So you got the PMOs, you got the program management portfolio, you got the portfolio of linkage to strategic objective number 1, and now you've got a better organization. So now you're not dealing with the whole organization, you're dealing with all of those projects that have relevance to the objective that you're trying to accomplish. Okay, next slide. But here's the problem we run into. I've seen this everywhere I go. I've seen it every place I've gone, and that is that management, these people who own these strategic objectives that you and I are working hard on to meet, generally don't recognize that every project can't be priority 1. Every project can't be priority 1. Now they think theirs is priority 1. There's 3 other senior level, maybe SVPs, who think theirs are number 1. So now you got 5 number 1s. Well, how are you going to manage 5 number 1s with a resource base that's set to support X number of projects, and all of them are not the same importance? So the resource pool manager is in a real bind here, because he or she wants to separate their projects into the right projects, but if there's no prioritization, they don't know which one should get the first attention. When I went to GE in the 70s, they asked me to look at their business plan, and at that time they had 25 what we called in the old days mission critical projects on the books. They had 25 of them, and what they wanted me to do was take a look at their listing and see if I'd captured the scope well enough and if I'd made some estimates on time and so on. So I said I'd be happy to do that. This was as a consultant. I was with GE. I left on a Friday, came back on a Monday as a consultant, doubled my salary. So I'm saying, oh, I'll be happy to do that. So I'm looking at their list, and they've done a good job. General Electric's a good company, done a good job on defining the projects quite well. The scope was really quite well defined. They'd taken a shot at some resource requirements. They'd taken a shot at a little bit of time and cost. But I'm reading through this, and I said, this looks good. These are 25. Yeah, these are all 25 for next year. And I said, fine. But I said, is this the priority? Is this listing 1 through 20? Is that the priority? They said, no, the priority's on page 2. So I turned this report over, and on page 2, it said project number 1 was priority 1. Well, that made sense. And then it said project number 2 was priority 1, and project number 3 was priority 1. And by the time I got done, all 25 projects were priority 1. Now, how does this help anybody make decisions about how we're going to execute a project when they're all considered priority 1? It's ridiculous. It's not. It doesn't make sense. It's easy for the senior level because then they don't have to decide. But now we've got to look at, we're trying to get into a position where we can not only strategically link our projects, okay? We can not only strategically link them together vertically, but now we also have to recognize that we need to link all these things together horizontally. So we can integrate vertical from the work package up through the strategic objective. We can integrate horizontally from how we apply resources on which projects have higher priorities than others. So that's the environment that we want to get through. So if you look at, next slide, that's fine, you did that fine. If you want to look at this appropriately, what we're really trying to do, and what's been missing for years, is a strategic linkage. In other words, where we link everything together. I mean, if I talk theory, if I've got a strategic objective, and let's say I have a portfolio of 6 or 7 projects under that strategic objectives, I want to link all of those projects together in a way so if one project has encounters a problem or a difficulty, and the response to that problem or difficulty impacts 3 other projects in the portfolio, now we can have a conscious decision. Now we can talk about priorities. And sometimes all the work we want to do doesn't get done, but the high priority work gets done. That's the difference. We can either do 5 high priority projects really well, or we can do 25 sort of priority projects kind of good. That's not going to work. We want to get the most out of the project work. We got a lot of expensive people focusing on projects that perhaps don't deliver nearly the return on the investment that some of the higher level priorities would be. But we've got to get management to predict what those priorities are. We've got to get them to tie into this process. Next slide. So what you have to understand, and you really have to take some time and think this through, because I think one of the things that we have done in project management is sometimes sort of encourage people to think myopically. Just focus on your work. Don't worry about anybody else. Focus on what it is you have to do. Well, I mean, I can understand why we do that, but the thing is, everybody's a stakeholder on any given project. No matter how big or how small, that project has stakeholders. And one of the stakeholders, obviously the project manager. More stakeholders are any one of the individuals who are being asked to contribute. Maybe it's work packages, maybe it's just support staff. Any of those that are contributing to the ability to get that project done is a stakeholder. All the support groups, legal and quality and IT and all those are all stakeholders in the project. And then finally, we've got to recognize that senior level people, the people who created these strategic objectives, are also stakeholders. They also need to be tightly woven into the communications process. Now, I don't want to bother them with insignificant things. Don't misread what I'm saying. But anything that looks like it could have an impact on the project, which by definition has an impact on the strategic objective, that needs to be communicated. It needs to be communicated effectively and thoroughly so that we can make the best decisions for the organization. The people are maybe it's not clear to some people, but I think I get it. It's the people that deliver projects. It's not the project manager. It's not the strategic objective manager. It's the people. So we need to incorporate ways to keep those people involved. Now, what I mean by that is it's so critical. If I want to maximize the performance of people working on my project, I have to create an environment where they want to be there. They said that's the difference between a volunteer and an employee. A volunteer wants to be there. So I've got to create an environment where they want to be there. I tested this theory out in 1990. I was asked by a firm in Castleton, Indiana, near Indianapolis, to come onto their organization as a consultant and organize and run a Save the Company project. Now, they were blood glucose monitoring in home use for diabetics. That's the field. And they had led the market by 70% for years. And then Johnson & Johnson came up with a new, easier to use, faster, sometimes more accurate in-home use tool. And so they just hammered my company in the marketplace. They were losing market share, 3 market share points a month, and each one was $3 million on the bottom line. So it was big time. So they brought me in. They said, here's what we need, Lee. We need a miracle. We've got to get, our marketing people say, if we don't get a new product that's better than their product into the marketplace in 18 months, there's probably a pretty good possibility we're going to shut the doors. We will have lost so much market share by then. Well, at that time, they were a $1 billion a year company. Now, they were owned by the Engelhorn family out of Mannheim, Germany, operating out of Indianapolis, okay? And so 1 billion, that's not, I mean, that's a decent sized company. I mean, that's what I make in about a year. But if you look at this, you got to realize they were saying that they needed a miracle, because what I found when I investigated is the typical development time for a project like that is 3 years. So now he's asking me to do it in a year and a half. So half time, 50% faster than it's ever been done before. So I agreed. I said, if you do some things that I think need to be done, I think I can do it. I had confidence I could do it. I had just left a very important job with the largest contract research organization in the world. So I was confident. So I said, here's what I need though. I need dedicated resources. You see, to create miracles, you don't do them with matrix team. Very difficult to do because they have more than one allegiance. They're in and on 4 or 5 different projects at the same time. So I want that. I want unlimited resources. If I want to spend money, I can spend money, and I want as much as possible co-location of the team. He gave me all 3 of those in a heartbeat. Well, why wouldn't he? He's going out of business if he doesn't. Well, the fact of the matter is we got the project done. We delivered it in 18 months. It regained massive amounts of market share very quickly. And 3 years after we introduced the new product, Roche Laboratories acquired this company for $11 billion. That's 10 billion more than they were doing in revenue 3 years prior. So this has been written up as a miracle project. The PMI organization wrote it up in, I think it was 2002 or 3, I forget now, but it's been written up in the PEMNAT magazine. Well, let me just give you the reason I told the story is that when you get somebody that needs to do a lot more work than they normally would do or think they can do, you got to motivate them. You got to inspire them. You got to tell them about the linkage. In this case, it was an easy one. The linkage, strategic linkage was, if we don't get her done, this business is out of business and you won't have a job. So I had a big advantage from that standpoint. But without that linkage, I couldn't have stated that. I couldn't have made that point. So these people, 205 people is what my team maxed out at. 205 people worked 14 hours a day, 7 days a week for 18 months to deliver that project, okay? And how we did that was we made it so people loved being there. People enjoyed the experience. People felt they were making a contribution to the success of the organization. They weren't doing busy work. They weren't doing filler work. They were doing good work. And this included clerks, support staff, everyone on the team. So it can be done. I can replicate that. I don't know if I would. It's a lot of work, but it could be done if you focus on tying it to the strategy, using that linkage to empower yourself or to influence your ability to get done what needs to be done, and then make it a happy place to be for the people that are working on it. Okay. All right. Next slide. So what we've done over the years is that I kind of get tired of this because every year, New Year starts with a new bunch of tools. You got more tools, add tools. When I look at LinkedIn, half the LinkedIn posts are about some new tool, some new leadership technique, some new scheduling concept. Come on. This ain't brain surgery. This is common sense stuff. But you'll notice in my slide, the common sense is not inside the box because common sense ain't common anymore. But there are some things I do want you to be sure that you've taken time to effectively create and utilize in your projects to maintain this strategic linkage. And that is the work breakdown structure. Now, when I first started working in the field, we had lists. We didn't even call them work breakdown. We had lists of things that we had to do. Well, that's clearly evolved over time. The Department of Defense in the U.S. really made this stand out in the 50s and 60s. And so now the one tool that in my view is non-negotiable, you got your project has to have a work breakdown structure. It creates the framework for everything we need to maintain that linkage. So look at that. And let's say we go down from the top level to the bottom level where we have what we call work packages. And that's 5 levels. There's 5 levels deep of decomposition. Well, that creates the framework for information processing. That creates the framework for allocating resources based on scope. It gives us all the information we need to effectively plan the work that needs to be done. Not schedule it, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but plan the work that needs to be done. And they used to tell me in the Department of fence, if I created a work breakdown structure that went down into the 5th or 6th level, the theory was that I could go down to that level and pick a work package that was at that level, and I could theoretically track that work package all the way up the work breakdown structure until I could see what strategic objective it supports. That's what we want. That's what we want. So you got to start asking the question, where does this project fit? What objective does it support? You need to be informed. You need to be educated to see, no, don't just give me a project and run away. Give me a project, tell me where it fits, and then we'll make sure we get it done for you. Okay? So WBS, very, very important. The next one, of course, is the schedule. And I'm not talking about bar charts and Gantt schedules. I mean, they're great. They're easy. They compare time against the work to be done, but they don't show interdependencies. They don't show overlaps. They don't show float time. So we need to create and use an integrated logic network schedule. Now, PMI has endorsed a precedent diagram method, rightfully so in my mind. And basically all that is a little bit fancier bar chart that basically shows what the output-input relationship is between all of the work packages. So once I've done that and taken the time and invested time, then I will end up with a forward pass and a backward pass based on the time for each work package. And now I will have a critical path and float paths. Now, what we've come to learn over the years is if you've got, for example, the project I did in Indianapolis, we had an integrated logic network with very, very well-defined critical path, and that had 895 work packages, okay? 895 work packages, and only about 70 of those, a little less than 10% of those, were actually on the critical path. And the beauty of that is now I know where to focus my time. Because if there's something on a critical path that's moving, that's slipping, that's having a problem, and I know that project's linked to the strategic objective that the CEO or the CIO or the CFO or the COO or one of those C guys is paying attention to, then I know I got to respond. If I see problems occurring that only eat float path, now I've got more flexibility. I've got more ease in how we do that. This also helps the resource pool managers who are trying to juggle their people among all the projects that are supposedly priority one. So those are the schedule you have. The only other thing that I think you need to be sure to invest an appropriate amount of time in is risk management. We really need to give some thought to how do we manage risk more effectively? How can we look at what can go wrong? Now, again, in the agile concept, it's a shorter term frame, so you're getting to deal with very realistic things. In the predictive model, you got to reach a little further out to see what the impacts could be, and they can be people impacts, product impacts, facilities. Lots of resources need to be expended on risk management. Because the worst thing a risk manager can do is, yeah, I thought about that, but I didn't really do anything about it. Well, then, you're not. If you're a PMP, and I bet you a lot of you are PMPs, I was one of the founders of it. I'm not going to give it up to people who want to do a halfway job. We got to do the right job. And now that they're giving us, by the way, you don't understand it, but when they talk about, well, we really need to improve our strategic design and project delivery. They are opening the door to the vault. You're getting an opportunity to play in the big game by understanding what those things are. Okay. All right. Next slide. Just threw this one up here for the heck of it because waterfall. I don't know. There's still some organizations do waterfall. Mostly they're real old people that's what they've been doing all their life, and they're not willing to change right now. That's the old dog's new trick thing. Well, I got to tell you, if you're in project management and you're not willing to adjust to the new world, whenever those kinds of changes are made, you'll be history before you want to be. So I'm not a big waterfall guy. I'm not a big agile guy, but you know what? That's the rule. The PMBOK, the new PMBOK, 7th edition, comes out in January, is going to be 50% of its content will be agile hybrid based. 50%. Okay. When the first one came out in 1996, nobody knew what that was. And so you can see the changes that have taken place. So if you don't want to get up to speed, if you don't want to understand, if you don't want to play ball, then take your ball and go home, because that's what it's going to have to be. But there are still some waterfall groups around. I do some teaching for the LDS Church out in Salt Lake City, Utah, and they have two shops. They have a Agile shop and they have a waterfall shop. And if you look at the waterfall, it's all the old timers. But they still get their jobs done. It's a little different, maybe. It's not as fast as it might be. But the fact of the matter is, you got to move. You got to move to what's new. Next slide. And so what's new is obviously rolling in the idea of Scrum. Now, if you've ever watched this sport be played, it's very analogous. That's why I think that's why they end up calling it Scrum when we try to decide what these requirements are going to look like. Everybody's got a piece of the action. Everybody's involved, and at some point in time, the requirements scored out, and we take that and we run with it. I don't know how much more simple I can make it, but that's the idea, is that we're going to all get a chance to be involved in how we define and or execute the requirements on this project. So as it has an impact on the strategy that the organization has captured, then we can react to that. We can look at it on the daily stand-ups. We can look at it on the retrospectives and make sure that we incorporate that kind of stuff. And those retrospectives, I've been preaching for years that the closeout piece is one of the most important pieces for the learning curve aspect. Well, with retrospectives, this happens much more frequently than the closeout process takes place. So we've got to adjust. We've got to understand what needs to be done. Next slide. So here's your next challenge. Go sell this idea to management. What I mean by sell it is, if we've got all the things I've talked about, we have to have a PPM. We have to have an automated decision support information capability, one that will let us to coordinate and integrate vertically and horizontally. And I think this is the key. Now, this is a hot topic right now. Last 2 or 3 years, everybody's coming out with a PPM. I've been doing some work recently with a company in Ireland called Cora Systems, and I've taken some time, invested in time to see, how does this work? How is it that we can capitalize on the capability of a PPM to improve my performance as a project manager and improve your performance as a senior level manager with strategic objective responsibilities? So we've got to be able to do that. Now, the thing is, that's not cheap. That's not cheap. It costs money to get information systems that deliver sound, timely, comprehensive project management information system capabilities. You got to invest some money. This is why management gets reluctant. This is why the disconnect between strategy and projects still takes place in many cases, is that there is no inherent information linkage capability. So you really have to make sure that you take that into mind and attempt to, I don't want you to become salesmen. I don't care what system you get. Any PPM is better than the one you don't have now. And so take a look and see, what can you do to convince management there's value here. There's a return on my investment, and have them seriously think about providing that integrated capability to link strategic objectives with the project delivery. Next slide and last slide. Now you have a choice. You have a choice. You can do it and end up better off for it, or you can do it and end up higher level senior management, or you can not do it and end up like this guy. Now, I know some people that resist. The resistance of change has been validated wherever you go. Spencer Johnson wrote a book called Who Moved My Cheese? It was basically just about, come on, man, you got to understand, change is automatic. Change is going to happen. I mean, if I'm thinking back to 1967 and I had the attitude that I'm not going to adjust to change, I'd look just like this guy. So you've got to open your mind thinking about what can you do to enhance your ability to help the organization become more successful. And as a byproduct of that, you'll become more successful too. All right, that's all I've got to say from a formal presentation standpoint. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Lambert, for this impactful presentation. So let us handle some questions raised by the audience. So, okay, so that's one thing. One of the things we'd like to learn from you is what are the common elements of projects, or let's say programs, that do successfully deliver on strategy. If you look across sectors and across project sizes, what have you observed and what has been your experience around the key factors that keep teams strategically aligned?
Wow, that's a tough question. Do you have a couple hours? Yeah. Here's the thing. I don't think it's not that difficult in one way, but it's incredibly challenging in another. First of all, you have to have well-defined projects with well-defined outputs and outcomes. Once you have that, then it's a matter of identifying the linkage to the business. What business objectives will this project support? Now, once you've got those two important elements, now you've got to deal with resource allocation, remembering that you're competing with all the other projects in the organization that are trying to steal some of those same resources you need for their project. And so if you've established the linkage between the business and your project, this gives you leverage with the resource pool owner to give you a higher probability of getting the right resource at the right time. Now, if you do that and then you don't get the right resource at the right time because you've established this business connection, some of your variance analysis will include, if we don't get X number of subject matter experts, we're going to slip this project by 6 months. And by the way, the strategic objective is due in 3 months. So I've made that connection. And now what I get is I get some support from the decision maker. Instead of, right now the way it works, unfortunately, at least I hear it all the time, is that the first time the business objectives are realized to be slipping or in danger is when it's too late. It's already happened. It's already happened. Now I go with my tails between my legs and say, oh gosh, I don't know what happened, but we're 6 months late. Well, why the hell didn't you tell me this like 6 months ago? That's why the information system becomes so important, is I want a trend. What's happened yesterday will continue to happen tomorrow unless somebody does something about it. So I want to create the framework. You need a baseline. You've heard that term 1,000 times. You need a performance measurement baseline that's linked vertically and linked horizontally to the resource pools.
Okay, great, awesome. Here's second one from Ahmed Abdesalam. So he said, projects are temporary by their nature and are usually executed by temporary organization and resources. So how we can shift these temporary resources focus from project delivery to value delivery? So which KPIs need to be implemented?
Yeah, the whole idea of KPIs, it's another one of these hot topics that just last couple of years, everybody KPIs, okay, whatever. Basically, what are we measuring that's important and critical? You're right about projects being temporary. That's the nature of it. As you read the definition in the PMBOK, it says that very clearly. It is temporary. Therefore, when the project's over, all those resources that you've allocated to that has to go back to their home. Now, what that means is we should be communicating effectively and relatively often with the owner of the resources so that they can begin to plan the re-entry into the structure that they need to pay attention to. We don't, and the other thing that's happening right now is people are beginning to realize that a project's not over and when the project's outcome is delivered, it's over when the product is used as it was intended to be used. So now the project life cycle is stretched out a little bit. And we have a tendency as project managers to say, oh gosh, we delivered that, we're done, we wipe our hands of it and go on to the next project. But in reality, we don't know if it's a successful project or not. If it's not utilized, if it's not being purchased or used by the user, then we may have had a project that finished on time and on budget, but the user community didn't utilize it. So you've got to take all that into account. My team of 205 were dedicated. I had them all, okay? But that still didn't relieve me from the responsibility to work with the resource pool owners from where they came to make sure that the reintegration would take place. Because when that project was over, many of them were worried they wouldn't have a job. They we'll work really hard so we don't have a job. And so we had to make sure that the reentry was taken care of as well.
Yeah, great, awesome. Here another one, so from Islam Sharif. So are there any plans or strategies to implement earned value management system in my organization, so her organization, by the way, and how to convince the team to use this technique to track the performance and progress of our projects?
The whole earned value thing is one of God's big secrets. How do you capitalize on the use of it? I'm a zealot when it comes to earned value. I've written a couple books on it. I've implemented 4 earned value systems in major corporations. I think it's the best thing. We have a saying here in the States, the best thing since sliced bread. But the problem is when you use earned value, you're going to be holding people accountable because you're actually measuring value based on work accomplished and cost to accomplish that work. And it requires a lot bigger commitment. It requires a lot more attention to planning and managing. Now with automated systems, it's a lot easier from a structural standpoint, but this is a whole cultural thing. If your organization is culturally deciding to implement earned value, they better know what they're getting into, because it's huge, and it will sap resources in the beginning until everybody gets up to speed. One of my main jobs for the information systems I put in place was to provide user training, not the kind you get out of books, not the kind you find in colleges, but actual hands-on. This is what you do with earned value training, and that made a big difference. We got two of our systems were validated by the U.S. government as meeting all the standards that had to be met for earned value. So if you're doing it, God bless you. I wish you the best of luck, because it's a challenge. It really is. Is it value return? No question. I never ever hedge my bet on saying earned value is one of the best things that's available in project management.
Great, awesome. So here's another one, very interesting one from Walid Akteri. So he says, who is responsible to bridge the gap between organization strategy and project execution? So is it the sponsor, the CEO, the PMO, or project manager role?
That's a good question. I think I'll give you my opinion for what it's worth. I believe, and because I'm big on this topic, I believe all of that responsibility, now it doesn't mean others won't be involved, but all of that responsibility rests with the project manager. The project manager needs to understand what that linkage is, needs to manage it to be sure that it's supporting the business objectives, needs to make decisions that are consistent with the objective. And I don't think anybody else can do that. The senior level people can't do it. I mean, they're looking at things at a very macro level. Project managers look at things from a micro perspective, and we can identify when there's a potential impact on the strategic linkage. So I think it's the project manager. Now he's got to coordinate, he or she's got to coordinate with the resource pool owners and coordinate with the resource, the support groups like legal and all those kinds of people. But at the end of the day, project manager has to stand up and take responsibility.
Great, awesome. So let's follow with Walid Akteri as well. He's elaborating furthermore in his question. So he says, is it more suitable to speak about project value instead of project delivery when speaking about strategical level? So, and let me tackle with this subsequent question. So how to convert this objective in terms of business value that everybody engaged by the organization in projects can understand to implement easily?
Okay, that's an easy one. Thank you for an easy question. I appreciate that. Here's what I think. This is my belief. If the people who select the projects that you and I are going to be responsible for have not conducted a value add investigation, whether it's ROI, whether it's reduced costs, whatever those objectives might be, if you say, I'm going to produce this project that's going to enhance my profitability by 3-to-1 margin, then that you've gotten your value right there. What value does that project have? So then that relates to how do I plan the project? Because at the end of the day, the delivery isn't necessarily the delivery of a piece of equipment, for example. The delivery is what value has that added to the organization? And that's the approach that has to be done. So while project managers are responsible, they have to have a basis to compare that value to. That's why I think earned value is such a wonderful thing, because that's predicated on that very concept. What I'm doing is adding value, and I can quantify it and I can show it.
Great. So here's another question from Hajar Ashur. So do you think that the business analyst can bridge the gap between the project manager and the strategic committee?
Well,
if that exists.
You guys are good. These are all the questions that I'm answering all the time, and I appreciate it. Here's my view of that. I think one of the missing links in project management for years has been a good, effective business analysis. I think that for oftentimes project managers are expected to make those analysis from a business perspective, and in fact, we're not really trained to do that. For one thing, we're not trained to be business analysts. We're trained to be project managers, and that business analyst is the one that fills the gap. So you've got a senior level objective linked in to a strategic objective. You've got a project that says that's what it's going to take. That gap is what represents reality. So a business analyst has to step in now and look at, does this make sense? Does it make sense? Is it from a business perspective, can it be done to execute this project in support of this business objective? I told people, if you don't like project management, you got to think about being a business analyst, because that's mushrooming, just like project management did here. It's really beginning to grow. There's a business analysis certification, and it's a very important thing that needs to be done that many organizations don't realize the importance of.
Great, awesome. So let's stick with the business analyst, and here we have an interesting question from Mohammed Rabban. The strategy is submitted to the three, let's say, project manager, business analyst, and product manager. So how to create a balance without entering into conflicts, basically?
Give me those three again. I think I missed one of them.
So the three are project manager, business analyst, and product manager.
Okay, product. Yeah, the product gets to the difference between project and product is the product management side keeps going after the project management side is done, generally speaking. And so we have to balance that. The business analyst has to evaluate potential change, evaluate potential implementation strategies. In my example for the Indianapolis job, I was the project manager. We had a product manager, and the product manager came to me about 3 or 4 months into the project and said, we'd like to improve the efficiency or the accuracy of the blood glucose test by 10%. We think that'll increase our marketability significantly. And I said, well, let me talk to a business analyst. I said, is that something we can do? Can we accomplish a 10% accuracy improvement and still meet our schedule? And the business analyst said, well, let me take a look. She kicked in and analyzed all the elements, all the variables, and came back to me and said, the answer is no. If you go ahead and increase the accuracy by 10%, you're going to deliver 3 months late to the marketplace, and we'll be out of business. That's balancing the three. You see, that's all three. And by the way, so I had the final decision because we're dealing with the project. The product manager made a request, the business analyst analyzed it, the project manager made the decision.
Great, great. So let's have another one. So from our member Shukri Zamzmi. So he says, with the technological development and use of AI, artificial intelligence, will the project manager role and responsibilities be more focused on strategic aspect of the project more than the operational ones?
You know, I'm gonna kind of be easy on that because I'm not totally in love with AI as it pertains to project management right now. I'm trying to sort out what's that going to add in the way of value. I think it has some very good predictive capabilities, but I'm not. I mean, the jury for me is still out on how that's going to apply. It's a hot topic right now. If you go to any major project session, you'll see somebody there talking about AI. I think it will have an impact, but I can't. I'm really not in a position to quantify that yet.
Okay, that's fair enough. So, and we'll have this our last questions. So the time is ticking. So, a question from Al Zaytoun. So, what drives your passion today, Mr. Lambert?
Say that again.
So, what drives your passion today?
Yeah, you're looking at it. You're looking at it. You know, when I took this little thing on about doing free webinars for anybody in the world that wanted them, well, I won't tell you what my wife said, but anyway, it's my passion. I love project management. I'm convinced that it's the way all businesses should be run. Paul Dinsmore, a friend of mine down in Rio de Janeiro, in 1980 wrote a book called Managing Organizations by Project. And unfortunately, he was ahead of his time because that's what we're saying now, is we got to have strategic linkages by the project. So ultimately, we're managing organizations by project if we make that linkage connection. So my idea is if I can spread enough interest, if I can get people to stop and think and not be so overcome by the day-to-day pressures, that the professional project manager will continue to improve far beyond it is right now.
Great, awesome. So I would like once again to thank very warmly our speaker, Mr. Lee Lambert, and also express my gratitude to the organization team, starting with our president, Nawel Benzina, Imen Fakhfer, VP Marketing and Communication, Wasim Bouaziz, our chapter DA champion, and Ahmed Abdeslam, chapter volunteer. Kudos to this organization team and to the PMI Middle East and PMI support team as well. I urge you not to miss the third annual PMI Talent and Technology Virtual Symposium 2020 next June 10th. The virtual symposium will equip participants with the skills to address current challenges and the roadmap to guide them through the constant change of the future. So a lineup of distinguished speakers will examine the ways in which project professionals have responded to crisis and share their lessons to evolve beyond it. And last but not least, please stay tuned to receive further information about our next webinar that will be presented by our DA champion, Wasim Bouaziz, around the Disciplined Agile initiative. Once again, thank you all for participating in this special conference. On behalf of the entire team of PMI Tunisia Chapter, I wish you an excellent evening.